Okay, so what are we talking about? We are talking about Vigrahavyāvartanī, which is an interesting text because it deals with the harder problem, the harder part of Madhyamaka. So let me summarize what we've done last time and give you a couple of quotes from the Mūlamadhyamakakārikā. So on page 247, Nagarjuna say, "It is empty is not to be said, nor it is non-empty, nor that it's both, nor that it's either. Empty is said only for the sake of instruction." So this is what I would say, the relatively easy part of Madhyamaka, which is the idea of emptiness. Why do I say that it's the easy part? Because the idea of emptiness is basically that it doesn't make any sense to talk about how things are. That, salut Catherine, ça va? That it doesn't make sense to talk about how things are, but the only thing that makes sense is to talk about, how can I get, the gallery. I don't like to see myself as a speaker. It's very disturbing. But now, okay, I'm just one of the guys. Notice my t-shirt. I think I'm the first person to give a teaching on Nagarjuna with a Professor Calculus t-shirt. I don't know, I might not be the first, but just wanted to underline that. Okay, now let's be serious. The ultimate truth is that there is no ultimate truth. The ultimate truth is that it doesn't make sense to talk about how things are, because every time that we talk about how things are, we involve ourselves in contradictions. And this is what Nagarjuna talks at length about in his Mūlamadhyamakakārikā, starting from chapter 1 about causality, chapter 2 about movement, and then going on to deconstruct, to take apart one notion after the other, right? And that's the idea that we're trying to understand how things are, but in doing so, we involve ourselves into contradictions. And so it doesn't make sense to talk about how things are. That's why he says, I do not say that things are empty, nor do I say that things are non-empty, because to say that they are non-empty would be a statement about how things are, and to say that things are empty would be a statement about how things are. So what do I say? I just talk about, where was my quote? I just talk about, oh, no, it's not that one, sorry. I just talk about empty is said only for the sake of instruction, which means emptiness is not how things are. This is on page 247, right? Emptiness is not how things are, because to say that things are empty is to describe how things are, and to say that they're not empty is to describe how things are. And so I do not say either of this. I do not make either of these statements. I just say that things are empty for the sake of instruction. What does it mean? It means simply that the idea of emptiness is aimed at undoing our attempt to grasp onto things to find how they are, right? This is what we do as human beings. We grasp onto things, we say, oh, this is how it is, right? And so what Nagarjuna wants to do is to undo this grasping. And so for the sake of undoing this grasping, Nagarjuna, but the Buddha before him, taught emptiness. But we shouldn't think that emptiness is how things are, because things are neither empty nor non-empty, because being empty would be one way things are, being not empty is another way things are, and both of these things are not possible. And so this is what we say, that the ultimate truth is that there is no ultimate truth, right? And that's the easy part of Madhyamaka. That's the ultimate truth, which is the easy part of Madhyamaka, right? The hard part is conventional truth, right? That's where things get really difficult and messy.
Professor, may I ask a question before you go to conventional truth?
Yeah.
So I've always wondered how to resolve this almost paradox in my mind, which is, so for Nagarjuna, when we say how things are, that is the source of suffering and keeping us trapped in samsara.
Yes.
But, so I'm a Hindu, so I, come from the Advaita tradition. And there, when you say how things are, that's moksha.
Yeah.
So I always feel like the problem is not saying how things are, right? Because one way leads you out of samsara, and Nagarjuna's perspective, it keeps you trapped in samsara, and I don't know how to think about it.
Well, grasping onto how things are keeps you in samsara. And so what you need to do is undo the grasping, right? And let things go. And that's why I think the teaching of emptiness is really easy, because it's just like none of our attempt to understand reality is going to work, right? And so when we understand that, we just let go of things.
But why does but if you were an Advaita Vedantan philosopher, you would say that by knowing how things, but for them it's a way out by asserting that this is how things are.
Yeah,
right?
That's right. Advaita Vedanta and Madhyamaka don't agree with each other. This is not the same philosophy.
Right, and that's what I find so interesting, is that they both claim, one says having no view is a good thing, and the other one says having a view is a good thing.
Yeah, now it's important to understand that this is at the level of philosophy, and that at the level of philosophy, we are talking conceptually, and therefore we are not talking about really understanding how things are, right? Whether we say that understand things, how things are, is the way to liberation or not, this is just still conceptual, right? And so or if we say that we need to suspend judgment and get rid of this attempt that we have to understand how things are, this is also at the level of conceptualization, right? This is what some texts call proximate ultimate truth, the understanding of emptiness at the conceptual level is not the real ultimate truth, is the ultimate truth what we can understand conceptually. And some texts talk about proximate ultimate truth, which is the ultimate truth we can understand conceptually. And then really the ultimate truth is when we understand it non-conceptually, which is different, right? And when we understand it non-conceptually, in a way, all conceptualization fade away, right? So here we're talking at the level of philosophy, where Madhyamaka is different from Advaita Vedanta.
Okay.
Definitely. Any other question about emptiness?
I think Savanch has a question.
What's that?
Professor Dreyfus, this is Subhansh.
Yes.
Nice to be here. This is my first time in your class. But
Okay.
I read Recognizing Reality almost 5 years ago.
Okay. Thank you.
I guess I just want to share some thoughts on this with you. You know, when at least I first entered the tradition, you know, many years ago, the Buddhist tradition. I come from a background of, you know, I'm a Hindu.
Okay.
And you know, when you first enter the tradition, you want to, you know, make sense of things.
Mhm.
And you know, in some traditions, it's, at least in the Hindu tradition, you know, you have a sense that there's a deity, there's a creator.
Yeah, sure.
Right? And so, you know, in many, maybe that's not at least the answer that you may get at the start, but you know, you at least your thinking is there's going to be something rich out there, right? Something
Yes.
substantial, something rich.
Yeah.
And then you spend, you know, so much time in the Buddhist tradition, and you at some point in time you come to the understanding, like you're saying, that there is no ultimate reality.
Yeah.
And that's a kind of a, you know, it's striking in a way. I mean, it's a very
Yes.
a very bold assertion,
It
because
is.
doesn't it? Because I mean, if you even look back at you know, many of the philosophers, not only in the East but in the West, they always come up with something, you know, something substantial to explain their sense of the world. And what I find really remarkable about the dharma, about Buddhism, and about the Buddha is that his assertion is very bold. I mean, it really stands as a contrast. I mean, he's not talking about nihilism, but his
No.
sense that it's a play of causes and conditions, okay, and that there's a background of karma, okay, that unfolds, and there's good and bad, but it's simply a play of causes and conditions, and
Yes.
you know, there's nothing else over there. That to me comes across as really striking, you know, compared to what you hear from other philosophers and from other traditions, religious traditions. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on the matter.
Yeah, I agree. Now, it's fair to say that this is one teaching. There are different teachings in the Buddhist tradition, and this is the teaching that we get through Nagarjuna, right? But I agree that in that teaching, the view is rather austere, right? That it's not, there is not a whole lot of things we can hold on to. And that's, I think, what is the aim of that teaching, is to let go of what we hold on to. And so that's a very radical teaching. Now, as I said, there are other teachings. So I don't think we can make statement about Buddhism in general, but I think if we follow Nagarjuna, this is a very austere view of what we should do as human beings. You're right to emphasize it's not a nihilist view at all, because it's based on the idea of dependent origination. Therefore, there is cause, and a cause at the conventional level, cause and effect exist, good and bad, and so on. So it's not a nihilist view, but it's a very pared-down view of what it means to be a human being, right? And yeah. Now, some people like it and some people don't like it, right? I personally find it very liberating because I think it's a very realistic view of the human conditions, like the Four Noble Truths are, right? It's not, we're not promising the heaven and so on. We're just telling you your condition, which is suffering, and where this suffering come from grasping, right? And so this is very much bare bone Buddhist, but this is what I personally think is the core of the Buddhist teachings. Now, you know, people have other views and people want to add many things onto that. And obviously I have nothing to say about that, but to me, that's what Buddhism is really about. The Four Noble Truths, suffering, the origin of suffering, which is grasping, and then letting go of this origin of suffering, and therefore leading a better life. Now, obviously, there is nirvana, and that's part of the basic teachings as well, right? And for Nagarjuna, nirvana is like emptiness, the full understanding, the full realization of emptiness.
Thank you.
Any more questions? So, now that we're dealt with the easy thing, we're going to deal with the difficult things, which is conventional truth, right? Now, chapter 24 is one of the very important chapter, obviously. And it basically starts with a series of poem about the fact that if things are empty, then there is no Four Noble Truth, there is no karma, there is nothing, right? So the accusation is an accusation of nihilism. And then on page 271, Nagarjuna reply, here we say that you do not understand the point of the teaching of emptiness. Emptiness is and the meaning of emptiness in this way, you're thus frustrating. And then the next page, he says the Dharma teaching of the Buddha rests on the two truths, conventional and ultimate truth. So this is where we need to talk about conventional truth, which is a really difficult notion. So in the Abhidharma, in the basic Buddhist teaching, conventional truth is easy to understand because there is a bedrock of reality, which is the dependently produced dharmas, events, however you want to call them, that the Abhidharma list, the list in a way that is not that important. What is important is this idea that, okay, notions like person, like cars, like chariots are conventional truth, but when you break them down, you find something which is real, which are the dharmas, right? The kind of momentary events that exist. And that's what's really real, right? And so when we say the car is conventional, yes, sure, the car is conventional because it has many different parts, but we understand that the car is made of parts and that these parts are ultimately real, right? And so the car may not be fully real, but if you want to say the particles that make this car are fully real. And that's a basic teaching of the Abhidharma, of basic Buddhism. And that's a theory of the two truths, which is easy to understand because if you ask why is it true that I can drive a car, the answer is, well, you know, car is conventional, but what makes the car, the components of the car are real. And so there is a way to cash out our statement in terms of an underlying reality. When you get to Madhyamaka, you don't have that anymore. And so the question is, what's conventional truth? And that's the most difficult question in Madhyamaka, because ultimate truth is easy. There is no ultimate truth, and that's the ultimate truth. Now, it's paradoxical. It's paradoxical, but once you work your mind around that, yeah, okay, it's a teaching about suspending any kind of attempt to find how things are, right? And then the question is, what are you left with, right? Because if it doesn't make sense to talk about how things are, what happens to all the distinctions that we make, right? And that's where things get more difficult. So on page 272, the author, what's his name, Mark Sidritz, talk about three meanings of conventional truth, right? One is mutual dependency, the other is the conduct of ordinary people, and then the third one is concealing, right? And these two meanings of dependent arising and concealing, they kind of pull apart, right? And so we have to understand, what are we talking about when we're talking about conventional truth? Because under one kind of interpretation, you can say, okay, you know, anything I think is true because it's conventionally true, which is obviously not what Nagarjuna has in mind, right? And that would be full-blown relativism, right? And so what we are talking about is really what kind of knowledge is possible. What does it mean to know something in distinction to have an opinion if there is no ultimate reality to cash my notion or to match my notion against, right? If there is no such ultimate reality, how can I distinguish what's mere opinion and maybe completely false from what's really a true opinion, a form of knowledge, right? A justified, a grounded opinion, which is going to stand scrutiny, right? And it is this distinction which is the most difficult to make once you in Madhyamaka, right? Because you have no way to cash out what it means to know, given that you have gotten rid of any idea of how things are, right? Because usually you cash out what does it mean to know in terms of, well, what does it mean to know the reality of the table is to know how the reality, how the table is in reality, right? Once you got rid of that, then you have to explain what does it mean to know what the table is? What does it mean to know something such as a table in contradistinction to merely have an opinion, right? Or to have a false opinion. And that's the fundamental difficulty of Madhyamaka, which revolves around the notion of pramana, right? Of tsema, pramana, which means valid knowledge or valid means of knowledge, depending on which school you're talking about. And the main pramana school in India is Nyaya, which has the view that there are 4 pramanas: perception, pratyaksha, inference, anumana, and then 2, which is scripture and comparison. These are the 4 pramana for the Nyayika. And the pramana means valid cognition, right? So knowledge. And so the whole of Vigrahavyāvartanī is a debate with the Nyayika about that notion of knowledge and also semantic, right? Okay, so any question about that so far?
I had a question, Professor.
Yeah, please.
When we're talking about conventional truths from the Abhidharma point of view,
Yes.
to me, it still seems like they also, even though the conventional truth of a car is made up of parts, but the fact
No,
that
not the conventional truth. That's the ultimate truth of the car.
right, but the conventional truth
Truth
of a car,
is a car, right?
right, is a car.
Yes.
But even the fact that they need to call it a car or what, or however they call this assemblage of things, isn't that also like conventional? Like, don't they have the same problem as Madhyamaka does in terms of conventional truth?
I'm not sure I fully understand what you mean.
So from what I understand is, like in Madhyamaka, when we are saying, you know, a car is a conventional truth.
Yes, they
right?
both agree on that.
Right. So
They agree. But it means something very different, because in the Abhidharma, you say the car is conventional. So what is the conventional applied to? It's applied to a bunch of particles, right? Which,
right.
Yeah. So how do you cash out the truth of the conventional truth? By looking at the underlying reality, right?
But the underlying reality is just a bunch of atoms. Like
Yeah.
they could be configured in any way, and then you would still
No,
have
they
to
cannot be configured in any way. It's the atoms that are configured in a particular way. And when they are configured in a particular way, you give the name the car. The reality is the atoms configured in a particular way. That's what's real. The name, the car, is just a convenient way to label a bunch of stuff which are way too complicated to talk about, right? We cannot talk about all the parts. And so we give this convenient label, which is the car, right?
Okay.
It's just for the sake of convenience, right?
Right. But,
Yeah. Now, if you're Madhyamaka, you say there is only convenience, because nothing, that convenience does not apply to anything.
yeah. I'll come back to this. I think
Okay.
my thoughts
So,
are confused.
What's that?
I was just saying my thoughts are confused. So
Yeah, no, it's very easy, because in Abhidharma, there is an underlying reality, right? So conventional truth is just the convenient ways we have to talk about what's in reality way too complicated for us to deal with, right?
yeah, okay.
What's difficult to understand is, what does it mean to be conventional when there is no underlying reality, right? That's what's difficult to understand. Because it would seem that, you know, anything goes, because there is no underlying reality. So I can talk call a car a buffalo, and it is a buffalo, right? Well, that's presumably not so easy, right?
But this is where I
Because
think
otherwise I could call a person who lost the election the winner, right? And there would be no way to make a difference. And so the whole set of human practices completely collapse because there is nothing to hold on to, right? And that's why Madhyamaka, the idea of conventional truth, is so difficult to understand.
So just to check with you, so for example, for Abhidharma, you have a particular configuration of atoms and you get
Yeah.
a refrigerator, right?
Exactly.
But the fact that we collectively choose to call a particular configuration a fridge or a computer or something.
Yes,
So
but the particles either fulfill the function they're called or they don't. If they don't, then your label is false, right? If you call a fridge a car, it doesn't work.
but that is equivalent to Madhyamaka, like
No, not at all.
the label has to
It's
match the
completely,
function. No?
It's 180-degree different.
Okay, I'll come back to it then once we get
Yeah,
through.
because Catherine? No, your mic is off. Your microphone.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that good now? Yeah.
Yep.
So why then do Madhyamaka bother about talking about relatively the other truths?
Which other truth?
Conventional truths.
What do you mean, why they bother?
The relative truth. Sorry, I'm just mixing the words right now.
No, that's okay. We
But
understood.
I'm saying you're
because-
showing that in Madhyamaka you can conventional truths, right?
Yeah.
And in Madhyamaka, if that's so complicated, they could also have dropped the idea that you cannot do it, just leave it.
What do you mean you can leave it? When you don't have any way to make distinction between good, bad, cause,
Okay,
effect,
that's okay.
karma, not karma,
All right.
suffering, not suffering, suffering, happiness. Everything that is relevant to human life is in conventional truth, right?
Yeah. So that they cannot give it up. They have to
Absolutely not. If they give up, they have given up the whole game. It's
Okay.
over.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's nihilism, right?
Right.
Yeah, which is
Okay.
exactly what Nagarjuna wants to avoid, right?
Mm.
Yeah. But what is important to understand is why is he so preoccupied about nihilism, right? Which is that once you get rid of a sense of reality as a base, as a ground, as something that underpins our conventions, then it looks like you're free floating in the air, right?
Mm.
That there is, because these conventions cannot be cached in terms of some kind of real stuff, right?
Mm.
So if I say this is my car and I'm talking about the cat, well, okay, Abhidharma has a way to tell us, okay, this is a mistake because the cat is not going to be able to fulfill the function of a car, which is to drive you at much higher speed, right? And so, good, there is an underlying reality. And so our convention makes sense because they tap into an underlying reality. Once you get rid of it, when it goes poof, then it's just like, how do we distinguish truth from falsity, right? And that's why the idea of conventional truth in Madhyamaka is so difficult.
So basically, the risk would be then nihilism if you don't.
The risk is nihilism. Yeah,
Okay, that's what I was. Okay,
Nagarjuna says, and that's what. Yeah.
Okay.
You do not understand the purpose of the teaching of emptiness, right? And the purpose And therefore, what you don't understand is too true, right? Yeah.
Okay.
And that's what's difficult in Madhyamaka. And that's why we have the Vigrahavyāvartanī, and it all revolves around, well, you can take it in two ways. You can think it about semantically, or you can think it about epistemologically. And that's what the Vigrahavyāvartanī is talking about. First, it's going to talk about semantics, and then it's going to talk about epistemology.
Professor Colin has a question. Is that okay for him to ask now?
Oh, sure. You need to unmute.
There we go. Yeah, to what extent, I mean, can you draw like an analogy between this Abhidharma view and then a sort of view of like a sort of physicalist view of science, where I mean, it's not the only interpretation of how things work, but you have these micro physics at some level that will explain
Right on.
But the sort of a macro level phenomena is in some sense not real.
Yeah, no, exactly. This is what my teacher of Nagarjuna would say about science, which you talk about physics, but it's in a way true of other science, right? Which is, most people have a very realist view of science, right? They think that science is to find how things are, right? And so the comparison that you make between science and Abhidharma is very much apropos. Obviously, I mean, the point is not that Abhidharma is science, but the point that both ways of thinking are based on this idea that we are going to find out how things are, right? And so once you give up this kind of realist view of knowledge, that knowledge is about finding how things are, then the question is, well, what are you left with, right? If knowledge is not to find how things are, what is knowledge about, right? And how to distinguish knowledge from falsity, right? And that's the Madhyamaka problem. That's a problem that you find in philosophy of science for people who are anti-realist, like maybe Thomas Kuhn, maybe not, certainly Lakatos and people like that, who think that the realist view of science as a way to finding how things are does not correspond to the reality of science. It's an ideological view, it's a philosophical view of science, because real science is much more messy, right? And so what we are saying is that if we go the Madhyamaka way, we open the Pandora's box, right? Because now we don't really understand. It's going to be much harder to think about what it means to have knowledge, right? And that's what the Vigrahavyāvartanī is all about. It's about knowledge. In the Indian context, it's called pramana, valid means of cognition or valid cognition. And so if the idea of how things are is a contradiction in term, what does it mean to have a pramana, right? What does it mean to have knowledge? What does it mean to speak, to make sense when you speak, right? And so there is a semantic question. What does it mean to make sense when you speak? And then there is an epistemological question, which is how can you have pramana if you don't have, if the notion of finding how things are is nonsensical, right? Does it make sense? Okay, so let's read a little bit of the Vigrahavyāvartanī. So stanza 1 to 3 is going to be about semantic, and then it's going to be about epistemology from stanza 5. So if an intrinsic nature of the things, whatever they may be, exist nowhere, your very statement must be devoid of an intrinsic nature. It is not, therefore, in a position to deny the intrinsic nature of the things. So who is talking? It's a Nayayika, right? Who wants to have a realist semantic, right? And so they say, if your statement doesn't have any intrinsic nature, how does it make sense? Now, which statement is he talking about? He's talking about the teaching of emptiness, right? So the question is, what is the semantic behind the teaching of emptiness, right? If you say the things don't have a svabhava, an intrinsic nature, then your statement doesn't have that, and your statement is not tapping into any intrinsic nature either, and so your statement doesn't make sense, and therefore, how can you refute anything at all, right? And that's a form of the Nayayika. As you can see, these are really smart people. They go right to the jugular. They don't BS around. They go right for the obvious problem of Madhyamaka, which is self-referentiality, right? Which is when you say that things are empty, how is it that you can still, make sense and talk about knowledge and make distinction about good and bad and so on? And that's what is the problem on the table, right? And that's what we're talking about, conventional truth. Then stanza number 2. Now, if this sentence is endowed with an intrinsic nature, your former proposition is destroyed. There is discordant, and you should state a special reason for it. So I think it's pretty obvious what it's saying. It's saying that if your statement has intrinsic nature, then obviously you've contradicted your fundamental thesis, which is nisvabhavata, right? The absence of intrinsic nature, right? So this is all about a self-referential argument. And number 3, if you think that it is like, do not make a sound, we replied, this is also not valid, for here a sound that is existent prevents the other sound that will be, right? So it's the same idea that how do you refute an idea of sabhava if your statement itself is not tapping into any intrinsic distinction, right? What's the semantic here, right? And so it's a real problem, right? Because Nagarjuna cannot say my statement makes sense because it has some kind of meaning, because the Nyaya would ask the question, in virtue of what does your statement have meaning, right? So the answer is much further down the path. It's on 29, which is probably the most famous passage in the Vigrahavyāvartanī on page 113 of his translation that I sent you, and it's saying, if I had the proposition, then this defect would be mine. I have, however, no proposition, therefore there is no defect that is mine. So if I had a thesis, the thesis that all things are empty, then I would have a problem. Because you could ask me, what's the semantic of your thesis, right? All things are empty. Okay, what's the semantic here? No answer. Because I don't have a thesis. And so this is a very famous, this is the most famous passage in the Vigrahavyāvartanī. And so the question is, what's going on? Is Nagarjuna completely bullshitting us? Or what is he talking about, right? This is where people have furious debates in Tibet, right? Do Madhyamikas have theses? Nagarjuna says, we don't have any thesis. And so what does he mean? That's a difficulty, right? And so people have interpreted that in many different ways. What does he mean? I have no thesis. Doesn't he have a thesis that all things are empty?
I thought in chapter 24, you read that, emptiness is equivalent with dependent arising, which to me seems like a thesis. It is a proposition.
It looks like a thesis, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So what do you make of this statement?
My question was like, do they mean different things when they say thesis?
Well, you might try to get out of that by interpreting thesis in a particular sense. That's one way to go about it.
I think,
and that's basically the Gelugpa way to go about it, is to try to finesse the word thesis and to say thesis is a particular kind of statement. Or you might embrace the paradox, right? Which is that we don't have any thesis about how things are.
But when you read chapter 24, it seems like there is a lot of statements being made about how things are.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like the middle way, this is the middle way, dependent arising is,
yes.
Yes,
I say this is, you're right, this is the really tricky part, right? Because it looks like, is it a sleight of hand? Or does he mean any particular thesis? So you realize here that, this is an interesting passage, right? And Tibetan masters have debated that at length. So one view is that we are going to restrict the sense of thesis, which is basically what Tsongkhapa and Gelugpa are going to try to do. The other approach would be to embrace the paradox, right? Now, let's be clear. When Nagarjuna says he has no thesis, he's talking about the ultimate truth, right? He's not talking about conventional truth, right? He's talking about the ultimate truth.
right.
Because conventionally, he has thesis, this is good, this is bad, this is suffering, this is happiness, right? So this is obviously Nagarjuna does have thesis in that way. So what is he saying is that I have no thesis about ultimate truth, about how things are.
You have many questions, Professor. I think Colin has a question.
Yes, go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Well, this actually was sort of going back, and I don't know if there's any way this might help with interpreting the no thesis, but just with there seemed to be like a somewhat different objection going with the I'm trying to just find the verse number. Yeah, the do not make a sound.
Yeah.
So like
yeah.
in the first part, in the first couple of verses, the idea is almost like the statement like can't make sense, like it's meaning, because it's sort of denying any reference.
Yes.
But then the 3 is more like the statement can't do anything. Like kind of considered more as just an utterance. It can't do anything either, because if it lacks an intrinsic nature, it's not like it can't cause anything.
Well,
which Nagarjuna will turn around, but
Nagarjuna presumably say it's like do not make it's like saying do not make a sound, right? I mean, the Nayayika think that they can understand Nagarjuna as saying do not make a sound. And they think this doesn't work either, right?
Yeah.
Because, and do you think it would work?
Well, I mean, I just think that the Nayakas maybe, or the objectors may be saying like, I mean, I'm not sure if these are great distinctions to use for this kind of text, but like it's more of an objection to the pragmatics of the statement than the semantics. It's not just it doesn't make sense, but you can't even get someone to stop talking.
Yes.
If
you're right. It's really about it's also about the pragmatic of the statement, right?
And then.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just saying, I mean, and I don't know if maybe that helped, with some of the the thesis where well, I don't know, Nagarjuna can kind of agree that there's not a interpretation of sort of the emptiness that meets the requirement, what the sort of Nayakas are asking for at first, but at the same time it can still work, it can still work, it can still do something, because actually if it did have that
works,
sort of nature,
right?
and if it did have going to like the arguments in MMK, you actually you can't make sense of causality and with an intrinsic nature anyway, so he sort of turns it back on.
You're right, but the Nagarjuna statement has to be understood pragmatically, right? Meaning it works, right? It works despite the fact that he has no thesis about how things are, right? So how do you think it works?
It's conventional. It works, I guess.
No, it's interesting because
it works if it sort of helps.
The whole debate between Bhava Viveka and Chandrakirti is going to be about the nature of arguments in Madhyamaka, right? And so what does it mean to have an argument about emptiness for Madhyamaka, right? What's the difference between an argument and a shout, right? That's going to be the difficult thing, right? The difficulty that Madhyamaka faces, right? Because what you're saying is that Nagarjuna's answer, presumably, is something like yeah, despite the fact that it doesn't make sense to talk about how things are, it works, right? And so the question is, what does it mean, right? Does anything that works is okay, or what is the status of Madhyamaka arguments? That's going to be the most difficult question, right? That Bhava Viveka and Chandrakirti are going to fight about, right? So this is the most famous statement here. If I had a thesis, then this defect would be mine, and I have no thesis, and therefore I have no fault, right? And thesis here is presumably, under one interpretation, thesis about how things are, right? I do not have any thesis about how things are, therefore I do not have any fault, because what I am talking about is not about grounding my semantic into how things are. What I'm talking about is a purely pragmatic interaction, right? And then the question would be, how do you distinguish a Madhyamaka argument from a scream, right? Because both might work, right? If you think about Zen master, they hit you, right? Is that an argument? Does a job, right? So this is what we're talking about, right? If I had a thesis, I would have this fault. If I don't, since I don't have a thesis, I don't have any problem, right?
Richard, did you want to ask a question?
I think it's been addressed, but I just wanted to bring up that Westerhoff says in his translation, what Nagarjuna wants to say here is that he does not have any thesis of a particular kind.
Yeah.
It is that among the theses one should assert, there is none which exists substantially.
That's a very Gelukpa interpretation. That's a very Gelukpa interpretation, but is trying to restrict the statement to basically a thesis that exists intrinsically or that address the intrinsic nature of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
My interpretation is that this is a thesis about how things are. And therefore, because this is what Nagarjuna is really talking about, right? And so what he's saying is that your debate presupposes that I have a semantic that is based on some kind of understanding about how things are, right? That my semantic taps into distinctions that are based in reality, right? In a kind of sense of how things are. And so my understanding is that Nagarjuna said, no, this is not, I don't have any thesis like that. So the question is, what kind of discourse does Nagarjuna have? And I think Colin, you were right. It has to be understood purely on the pragmatic level, right? That is, the Madhyamaka discourse is in charge of clearing the ignorance of people, taking them out of the delusion of holding on to how things are, and then it has done its job, right? Sextus Empiricus compares his teachings, which is a form of skepticism, to a purge, right? It's not aimed at telling you how things are. It aims just at getting rid of the wrong habit, right? And the wrong habit is to hold on to how things are, right? And once the purge has done its job, then it's okay. That's the purpose of the purge, right? And I think it's, and Wittgenstein talks about the ladder and throwing out the ladder once you have climbed the wall, right? And it's the same idea, right? It's the idea of the raft. It's the idea of skillful means. It's the idea that teaching like emptiness are teaching about, but are trying to do something. And once that something is done, that's the purpose of the teaching, right? And you should not hold onto it. And so if you adopt this interpretation, then thesis is just thesis about how things are, right? Any other question? Because this is the most famous.
I think Savant, you have a question?
Yes. Professor, I haven't read this text, but this is, since you talk about this passage, I kind of would not be surprised that somebody like Nagarjuna, he's got this yukti corpus, he's got these 6 texts of reasoning, and I would just say that my guess is that across those texts, he is going to stand behind this statement, which is that you look at all of my 6 texts and you'll find that I have no proposition. Okay, that's going to be my guess. However, what I want to ask you is, he's also written the praises of the Dharma Dhatu.
Okay, that's presumably not the same person.
Okay, I see.
Presumably, because these praises are much later.
Okay, so you wouldn't bring any, you wouldn't go there as a form of counter argument.
No, I would not go there, because that's, now Tibetans believe it's the same person. But, there are several hundred years between these texts, right? So that's a little problematic. Now, there are 6 texts. And so there is a Ratnavali, which is, we believe, is also from Nagarjuna. So that's, the Ratnavali has many statements about what's good, what's bad, what the Bodhisattva should practice, and so on, right? So it's not that Nagarjuna doesn't make any positive statement, but I think the praises of Stotra, I don't think we should bring that into consideration.
Okay. That's why I asked the question.
No, it's a perfectly reasonable question. It's just I'm a Western scholar. And so if I'm told that somebody lived 900 years, I'm going to think that it's actually 2 people. They may bear the same name, but it's 2 people. It's not the same person. That's just my assumption. Now, I could be entirely wrong, but it doesn't make a lot of sense.
That's fair. But I want to follow up with did Nagarjuna not, is then, if you look at any of his, I haven't looked at the Ratnavali that closely, but is there nowhere that he talks about Buddha nature other than the praises? Set aside the praises, but anything else?
We should read at some point, maybe if we have time next time, we can read the chapter on Nirvana. That's the only place that you could hang your hat on. And no, he doesn't.
Okay.
Now, some people say that Nagarjuna was not a Mahayanist. I have no idea. I don't know. But there is if we take off the table the stotra, it's a very pared down, it's a very austere view of Buddhism, which is basically based on the Four Noble Truths and the Two Truths, right? And then you have the Ratnavali, which talks about how people should behave and so on. And that's what I see in Nagarjuna. And to me, it makes complete sense because, yeah, that's one form of Buddhism, right? Then obviously you have later development in which you become, in which Buddhists evolve and becomes more complicated. But if you look at Nagarjuna, it's a very pared down understanding of Buddhism as being about the Four Noble Truths and about how to behave. That's Nagarjuna, right? And I think, yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense because to me, that's the essence of Buddhism, right? But, you know, there are later traditions which add many things, and I would certainly not decry these traditions, right? They are very rich and very meaningful, but Nagarjuna is a very basic understanding of the Dharma, right? There's Four Noble Truths, Two Truths, and then how to behave, right?
But I mean, when he praises the Buddha, he acknowledges enlightenment.
Yeah, Nagarjuna has a chapter on nirvana, so he clearly acknowledged enlightenment, but he never talks about Buddhahood per se, right? He talks about nirvana, right? And so we have to surmise that for him, the Buddha is just an arhat, right? The Buddha is just the first person who discovered the truth and taught and then passed away. That's what the kind of Buddhism that is seen to be reflected in the 6 works of Nagarjuna, right? And so some people have said, why is this Mahayana? This is just a very basic form of Buddhism, right? Now, important to understand that there are 4 Noble Truths, right? It's not just suffering and the origin of suffering, but it's also the cessation of suffering. So this is complete teaching, right? But it's a very pared down teaching, and there is nothing about Buddhahood here over and above nirvana, right? Which to me sounds already a lot. Any more questions? So the second part maybe we should do next time, which is going to be about pramana, right? It's the Nayayika is going to say on page 99. Now, if you say to deny the thing having apprehended them through perception, pratyakša, we reply that perception through which the things are apprehended does not exist. So this is going to be the debate about pramana, right? Which really start on verse on page 114, where he's going to talk about pramana. And that's a second line of argument that he's going to talk about, which is refuting pramana, right? And that's where the Svatantrika Prasangika distinction is going to come into, that is, what do we make of pramana, right? What do we think pramana is? What do we think, what kind of knowledge is possible if everything is empty, meaning we don't have any thesis about how things are, right? If we do not talk about how things are, how do we distinguish true from false opinion, what's pramana and what's not pramana, right? And so Nagarjuna is going just to say, no pramana. And so what does it mean? This is what's called the refutation of pramana, right? So we'll do that next time, if it's okay. And then we'll be done. No pramana, so that's okay. That's where now, no pramana, what does it mean? Well, you know, there is Bhava Viveka understanding, there is Chandrakirti's understanding. It's going to be complicated, right? But basically, that's what Nagarjuna is going to refute, the idea of pramana, which is advanced by the Nyayika. Now, the Nyayika base the idea of pramana on some kind of realist ontology. And so what Nagarjuna is going to deny is this kind of pramana, and then he's not going to tell us what we are left with, right? And so Svatantrika and Prasangika, or rather Chandrakirti and Bhava Viveka, are going to fight about what are we left with, right? And that we can talk about next time, if it's okay with everybody. Any more questions? Otherwise, I will have my dinner.
I think Richard has a question.
I don't want to keep you from your dinner, but I did want to ask if you wouldn't mind briefly explaining the difference between the Gelukpa interpretation of that Westerhoff talked about, where he says he has no theses which exist substantially, and what you're saying is that there are no theses about how things are. It seems to be that those are. I'm not sure I understand what the difference is.
The difference is how you cache. Okay. When I say the ultimate truth is that there is no ultimate truth, the difference is how do you explain that statement, right? And there is a very literal way to understand that statement, which is, the ultimate truth is that there is no ultimate truth, and that's a paradox, and that's it. Now, if you ask a Gelukpa what do you make of that statement, he will say, well, the ultimate truth is that there is no intrinsic reality, right? Now, to me, they come out the same, but it's two different ways to try to get to the same insight, right? One is embracing the paradox, and the other is saying, well, let's try to get rid of the paradox and explain what this is really about, right? And to me, they come exactly to the same place, but if you want to say in two different ways, right? And so what Westerhoff is explaining is a very Gelukpa way to understand Nagarjuna, what I am doing is taking things a little bit more literally, but basically we're saying the same thing, right? We're saying Nagarjuna doesn't have a view about how things exist intrinsically or how things really are, and so on, right? And so you can, if you want, you can refine this statement and make them non-contradictory, or you may say, no, I'm happy with the paradox because we are dealing with ultimate truth. And so making a paradoxical statement is not a problem, because the goal here is to cure people of the disease of holding on to how things are, right? We're not trying to describe how things are. We're just trying to purge people from a particularly wrong, harmful, let's say, habit, right?
That's very clear. Thank you very much.
Okay. Any more questions?
We'll save them for next week.
Okay.
Have a good evening. Thank
You
you,
too.
everyone.
Bye.
Bon appetit.
See you all next week.